Alrighty guys, we are back. This time, could Vellond survive Warhammer Fantasy? You see, I like doing these factions in their respective universes. In this case, Kingdom Under Fire is very Warhammer-esque, so it actually makes this transition very smooth, very easy, because they're both fantasy settings, high fantasy at that, which is even better. And they also have quite a bit of lore to them about the species and the nations that exist. Vellond is a nation. Now, the Vellond we're going to be using is the Vellond from Kingdom Under Fire Crusaders. The reason why is because that was pretty much the height of their power. Now, Kingdom Under Fire 2, they went under technological innovations and such, but they weren't quite as big and they weren't quite as strong as what they were during this time, where they were a huge major geopolitical power. So, we're going to use this with King Valdemar at the head, and we're going to discuss exactly what's going to happen if Vellond was to invade through some magical scenario the Warhammer universe. Now, up on display, we have a map of the Warhammer fantasy world. I would personally prefer if Vellond was more in the heat of the action, but in a more realistic sense, it would actually make more sense to give the Vellond all the advantages as possible. So what would be the most advantageous position to put Vellond? Well, as ironic as it is, I actually think it'd be best to put it near Nagaron, right next to the Dark Elves. And there's a reason for this. So you see, Dark Elves versus Dark Elves, while that does sound interesting, it actually is very advantageous for Vellond because they're both very similar societies, but there's some major key differences that would actually determine who wins the war. You see, Vellond and Nagaron, the Dark Elves, they both rule through a stratified society. The big dog at the top, who's usually some wicked, amazing leader, in this case King Valdemar, has been reputed as a very powerful sorcerer, so powerful that he can make an immortal become his friend because his sorcery is just that powerful. He's able to subjugate all the vampires around him. That's what forms the Senate in the vampires' kingdom known as Vellond. But the Dark Elves live in the middle class. And then at the bottom is all the slaves. And this could be any species whatsoever. Then we look at the Dark Elves. What's their society like? It's pretty much the exact same. The only difference is that they don't have vampires. It's just Dark Elves all the way up and all the way down. And then the slaves could be whatever species isn't a Dark Elf. Now, what's interesting about the whole Dark Elf scenario and why they would lose, if you're a longtime fan of this channel, you know that I actually like Malekith. I love him a lot. He's my personal favorite out of pretty much all the characters. He's really complicated character, very interesting, very compelling. But the reason why I hate the Dark Elves so much is because they've been invaded by like 6 different guys. I'm not saying like factions, I'm saying guys. Like just them and their army alone nearly destroyed the Dark Elf Empire several times. You're looking at Gorok, you're looking at Eltharion the Grim. I'm not joking, Eltharion the Grim literally led his own army into Nagaron and nearly made Malekith surrender by his own army. Like, what the fuck? Wood Elves even invaded some High Elf cities. It's like, what the fuck? Like, the Dark Elves are just getting fucked here, no matter what situation it is. And there's a few reasons for that. You see, the Dark Elf society relies really hard on their slaves. They don't actually do farms. They don't do any sort of agriculture. They don't do any mining per se. The only thing that they do is they use their slaves. They just have their slaves do all the work. And this has made their society very easy to cripple. All you gotta do is stop them from gathering slaves. That's all you gotta do. Stop them from getting slaves, and now they end up killing each other more than they're killing you. Then you also got a few other things there. Their leaders are sometimes preoccupied with other things. That to them seems great because it's some dastardly scheme, but reality is the enemy's knocking on your front door, dog. I think you should focus on that instead of some masterful scheming plan you have to disrupt the political situation in the Empire or some bullshit. But these are Dark Elves. They're very narcissistic, and they don't band together. This is also the bigger thing, is that when Nagaron's under siege, when any other place is under siege, the Dark Elves don't rally together. They don't go, oh, King Malekith, send your forces my way to help me. No, they don't. Because why would they? Their society is built on treachery and backstabbing. So when you're weak and you ask another Dark Elf for help, he's just going to say, oh, someone's kicking you in the ribs while you're down? Make that 2 people kicking you in the ribs while you're down. I'm going to take your shit too, whatever's left, once they're done. So it becomes this really interesting society where you have Vellond, a society that's actually unified and is willing to help one another, versus the Dark Elves, who the moment that things start to get tough, the moment things start to become a war of attrition, they collapse. They just surrender. They collapse immediately. So what would Vellond do in this situation after they have done a lengthy, probably 2-year, 4-year military war against the Dark Elves and then conquered all this land? Well, the thing is that the Dark Elves actually do build. They do build cities. Vellond does build. They build these giant towers, which is where the vampires usually live. And then they have many worker camps, which usually has Dark Elves and other species in. And from here, we can look at our next target. What about Norsca? You see, Norscan raiders is kind of an issue that the Dark Elves did deal with. So if Vellond took over the Dark Elves' land, then they would have to deal with that same issue too. But here's the thing. Vellond already knows how to deal with this. They've done it before. But this time they're dealing with humans, not orcs and ogres, not idiots. They're dealing with people who have average intelligence at best. This is where things get much easier for the Vellond nation. You see, when Vellond was dealing with a group of orcs and ogre tribes, they wanted to annex them because orcs and ogres are really strong. They're really great. They're awesome. They're really the backbone of the military because they're just so numerous. They're so tough. But the more important thing is that Norsca, just like the orcs and ogres in Kingdom Under Fire, Norsca, they actually tame animals. They tame monsters. They tame and they hunt mammoths. So why not? So this becomes this interesting scenario where it would actually be a war in Norsca itself between the tribes. Vellond would not directly attack any individual tribe. This is what Vellond would do. They would recreate the annexation of Hexter. For the next many years, they will supply weapons and armor that are finely crafted, finely done, to tribes that are willing to help them. Tribes that are willing to lend their aid. Tribes that are willing to enslave for Vellond and send the slaves their way. So then it would become a war in Norsca. We're talking all of Norsca would have this huge political backlash where now it's like the pious versus the greedy. Which chieftain would be stronger? The chieftain who's got finely made weapons and armor. His troops are heavily armored now from this finely made material that Vellond is freely giving them. Or the chieftain who's very religious and just hopes that the dark gods give him what he needs to win this war. Yeah, this is going to be a long one, but at the same time, Vellond does not mind sending in overseers, which are vampires, with large army detachments to come help out those tribes that are aiding them. So now you have a tribe who's not only getting amazing weapons, amazing armor, but now they're also getting military support. Oh my god, every tribe would just flaw over to Vellond. They would immediately say, hey Vellond, I just destroyed 3 Norscan tribes who disagree with you. Can you give me some good shit? Alright, thank you guys, thank you. And by the way, Vellond, there's a bunch of Bretonnian knights who are crusading into my lands. Do you mind dealing with that for me so I don't have to defend my own lands? Thanks, this is great. And this becomes what happens of Norsca, is that Vellond would not technically take them over. It would technically be more like an annexation, where they just slowly over time change the political situation of Norsca to where they just simply hire tribes. They just keep going, hey, Norscan guys, you guys have longboats. If you guys give us so and so many slaves and resources, we'll pay for everything. Oh, hey, Norsca, we noticed that there's a huge rift of demons coming from this area. Can you deal with those demons for us? We will give you everything that you need. We'll defend your tribe while you're even at it. And then it becomes even better. What if the tribe fails? Well, they're weak now. And now that they're weak, Vellond could just say, hey, seems like your chieftain is dead and everyone who was defending this village is pretty much gone. Now it's just us. So I guess that means you Norscan guys are now our guys. So then they could just take over the tribes. This is what Vellond would do. This is what Vellond has done in the games. I have no doubt that they would see the situation in Norsca and do the exact same thing. Now, it could be tough, especially with certain champions, especially with some champions who could just full-on flay a Dark Elf and hold the captain's head and just go, this is the weakness that you're submitting yourself to. But at the same time, Vellond would put up such a strong defense because they are a nation who builds walls and builds cities. So it would be hard for Norscan raiders to actually attack Vellond itself. All they would do is just keep killing the emissaries, keep killing the overseers, keep killing the supply chains. But all that does is it pisses off the chieftains who are like, Vellond is making us stronger. Stronger than the Dark Gods it made us. The Dark Gods, we have to beg for a gift. Vellond, we just have to tell them, hey, send me some weapons and I'll kick some ass for you. Like, psh, this is amazing. So now that we talked about that, let's talk about the farther north, the chaos itself. How would they deal with the Dark Gods? This is going to be a little tough because Vellond doesn't really have a religion. And on one hand, they do revere the moon because there are a bunch of Dark Elves in Vellond, and they do worship the moon. It's not really clear to say, though, what gods that they have. They don't really say any gods' names. They just say, by the gods, and that's it. So they are some sort of poly-religion, but we're not too sure. And the vampires themselves, they seem to understand that there's a god of darkness and a god of light, but they don't seem to actively worship. So it becomes this weird scenario where they will be fighting chaos, but they won't have any backing from their own deities. And this is actually very important in the Warhammer world because having a deity at your side or believing in a deity can actually make you do a lot better against these enemies. But I don't really think Vellond would have these issues. I think Vellond would actually have issues with the pleasure cult and possibly parts of the Corn, cults of rage. And the reason why is because the Dark Elves themselves. Now, Dark Elves themselves, they're very fascinated with raiding. They actually get an ant up their pants when they don't go out raiding and attacking people. So I have no doubt that Vellond would have a bit of internal issues managing cultists, dealing with maybe a few pleasure cults who are like, oh, my dear sweet, why are you wandering around with those nasty jewels when you could just come to Slaanesh and I could just put jewels inside your butt and then just pull them out, anal beat style. This is the point of Slaanesh. I could definitely see Vellond having these issues where some of the Dark Elves give in to pleasure and temptation. Like, the idea of having all these beautiful jewels, that's all they ever talk about, by the way. Like, there's many elves that we've seen, besides Cirith's sister, who actually do talk about jewels a lot. They can't help it. They love jewels because they like to steal and raid from people. And this could also lead to corn. Corn would actually probably feed into them a lot as well, because you have to remember, these Dark Elves of Kingdom Under Fire, they're very rageful. They're quick to kill the vampire overlords ruling over them the moment that they feel justified. They are quick to rile to anger and to revolt. They may not succeed. In fact, the Caedus Revolution, Caedus was the revolt of Dark Elves who believed that Dark Elves should rule Vellond instead of the vampires. The Caedus tried several times. I cannot probably count with my fingers how many times the Caedus openly tried to revolt against King Valdemar, and every time he squashed them. He squashed all their petty schemes, everything. And this is where I could see Khorne would be a little bit more tasteful for the Dark Elves, is that he stokes their rage. He goes, oh yeah, you just lost 30 of your sisters, and for what? So this Dark Elf Overseer can report back to her vampire overlords and tell her what a nice job she did commanding you when she did nothing? Yeah, let me give you some extra power in your hate so you can stab her through the fucking gut. I could see that. I could definitely see that. But as I said, if everything worked the way that I am saying it would work, by this point, Vellond would have Warhammer Dark Elves fighting alongside them. They would have Norscan Raiders fighting alongside them with their monsters. So chaos wouldn't even be much of an issue. The demons themselves, they would just simply send these Norskins to go deal with the issue, because Norsca would be much more fitted for these types of situations than they would be. Now, on to our next target. What else is a neighbor to Nagaron's location that Vellond would have maybe some issues dealing with? The Lizardmen. Now, the Lizardmen I actually don't think would be too much of a bother, because you have to remember, Lizardmen are extremely magically powerful, but they keep to themselves. They don't like to be messed with. And if you do steal from them, they will teleport to your city and absolutely destroy it. Like, full-on destroy them, as the Mundi style. Just giant beam of solar energy, your city's fucking gone. Skedaddle, skedoodle, your city is now caboodle. So knowing King Valdemar, I don't think he would actually pick a fight with the Lizardmen willingly. I think what instead would probably happen is he would just guard the border by building some sort of wall like he did at Raven Meadow. Raven Meadow was the border between the human kingdoms and Vellond's territory. He actually built a wall there. And I think that's pretty much what would probably happen. He would just build some type of shitty wall to just keep them at bay, but he would have no qualms about Norscan and Dark Elf raiders leaving his kingdom and bringing back riches. He would not have any qualms about that. But on the flip side, I don't think there's really anything valuable the Lizardmen would have that Vellond would seek. Vellond usually is seeking control over territories. And while the Lizardmen may have many powerful magical items, that's great, the cost of bloodshed would be just too steep. The serious power that the Lizardmen have, and the fact that you can't turn their own allies against themselves, there's no way to infiltrate them, there's no way to do anything to them, because they have this weird society that's kind of like a hive mind. It's just not worth it. There's too much blood to be spilled for not that much ground gained. The jungle itself is incredibly harsh, and seeing as how most of the Dark Elves are actually naked, and seeing as how they're actually very vulnerable to poison, it would be just not worth it, flat out. The poison itself would just destroy the Dark Elves. Now, I know you're going to say, but Freezer 700 and Kingdom Under Fire, the Dark Elves can actually heal in the forest. And here they are in lush tropical jungles. Wouldn't they heal in this situation? They would, and I'm glad you point that out. But the issue is that Dark Elves, while they can heal in the forest, if you look at their stats, they're actually weak and extremely vulnerable to poisons. Now, I've pointed out several times on Kingdom Under Fire threads that everyone's weak to poison. No one has a resistance to it, but the Dark Elves take the cake for having the most weakness. They are the most susceptible, and it makes sense because if they're mending their wounds from the trees, then it makes sense that venom or poison coming from those trees would probably affect them more severely because they're more receptive. And there is a few things that I do think that the Dark Elves would do well against in the Lizardmen. Like, the Dark Elves don't usually miss when they're shooting inside the rainforest or any forest whatsoever. Their bows and their slings are very adept for these types of jungle warfares, which is great. But the issue really is that they rely too on their cavalry. And when you're inside a lush jungle, there's really nowhere your cavalry can maneuver. So really you're just looking at just a magic fight. A magic fight with a bunch of arrows against lizards who, I'm not joking, the regular Saurus, anytime a dwarf quarreler would shoot his quarreler at the Lizardman Saurus unit, it would just break upon his skin. This was in the Book of Vengeance. So it's one of those things where it's like, fighting the Lizardmen just wasn't, it's not worth it. It's really not. It's better for King Valdemar because he is very, very smart. He would probably just leave it where he would just say, hey, Norskins, hey, Dark Elves, hey, Warhammer Dark Elves, you guys can raid it, but if the Lizardmen come knock into our door, I'm just going to throw you to the wolves. Like, I really don't care. But if you do bring back riches, that's great for me. So up next is the High Elves. Now, the High Elves is very difficult, because honestly, I could see it going either way. I could see where the High Elves destroy Vellond, or I could see where they just get driven to a stalemate. And this isn't because I'm a High Elf player. I'm not. I actually don't like the High Elves that much. But The issue is that their military is extremely elite, like extremely elite. And this is something that Vellond, while they do have a professional standing army, it is not that elite. They do have Yenicharies, which are elite soldiers, but they don't have this crazy eliteness to them where they're stomping on precisely disciplined steps. They don't do that. And it's this sort of martial prowess with this hundreds of years of experience that can definitely put Vellond on edge. Because you see, there's a lot of things about Ulthuan and the High Elves that is a little bit too overpowered. But overall, I would just say, So let me explain why this is. Let me explain why this is the case for the High Elves. You see, right off the bat, in order for Ulthuan to be attacked, Vellond would somehow have to figure out the magic behind the ocean. Because the ocean has this natural magical barrier that the elves put that stops people from sailing into Ulthuan by accident. So in other words, if you're going to get into Ulthuan and invade it, you're going to have to figure out some magical way to break that barrier. Now here's the other issue. Vellond is pretty much a landlocked nation. They pretty much have zero concept of any sort of naval inventions whatsoever. Now, they may have to borrow from Norsca, but Norsca's only got these longships that's really not sail-worthy, especially against the High Elves' navy. The High Elves have an actual navy. Longships, they're not capable of naval engagement to the same extent as these ships would be, like galleons and these. I'm not joking, some of the High Elf ships are actually kind of crazy. They're more like castles on top of a boat rather than an actual boat itself. They're pretty crazy looking. And then you also have the eagles swooping down, scooping up passengers, and you have all these crazy magics coming out of it. It's really crazy. But that's just the thing. I don't think Vellond could invade Ulthuan, even though King Valdemar is wickedly powerful sorcerer who could probably figure out some way. The real issue is transportation. How could he transport troops in there? This is where I think the only real way he could intentionally attack Ulthuan is through subterfuge. Sending the Dark Elves that he has, because they do look pretty similar to the High Elves. They are, after all, the same species. They're just different in skin color because of the locations they grew up in. But it has been noted Dark Elves have infiltrated several fucking times. So I do think this would be more of the situation where King Valdemar would do his best to just simply steer clear of the High Elves. They have wickedly powerful sorcerers. They have a lot of dragons. And the dragons in Ulthuan are much crazier than the dragons in Kingdom Under Fire universe. Kingdom Under Fire universe, a dragon was not able to destroy whole towns by itself. They were powerful enough to do that, but they were also very fragile. Like, just regular arrows could take them down. So it's one of those things where it's like, I don't think they want to tempt them in some sort of engagement because the High Elves have so much at their disposal to just crush them. They have a lot of naval capacity. They have a lot of just interesting arrows and such, like the Sisters of Avalorn using magical bows and magical arrows. It would be a very difficult fight. Now, the one thing that Vellond does have at its side is numbers. They have a lot of numbers. And they also have slaves. They have Norscan mercenaries to hire and send over. They have a lot of things at their disposal to help them if they ever do get engaged upon by the High Elves. And this is why I say it would be more of a standstill, where the Ulthuan factions, they can board and embark on their ships to sink any Vellond ship. Sure, absolutely. But the issue is that they can't really supply block Vellond because Vellond doesn't rely on trade or their navy. They're a very landlocked nation, so they rely more on the land trade. In order to stop that, you'd have to actually get on the land. And getting on the land is very dangerous for the High Elves for a lot of reasons. The main one is just, as stated before, Vellond's army has a lot of cavalry in it, and they have a lot of arrows. They have a lot of these amazing pretty much half-naked women with these giant shields who literally dash at lightning speed to the point you only see a blur because that's how fast they are when they stab you. Yeah. High Elves are not going to do that good against that. They do have elite troops, don't get me wrong. They could probably take down 300 Dark Elves per troop, which is great for them. But Dark Elves don't have a population issue. They're a thriving community. They don't have the sort of issue of breeding and fertility like the Warhammer Elves do. So it would become this landlocked fight. And then we're not even talking about the slaves. If they had any slaves, they would put them into the forefront as well because, hey, it's easier and it's cheaper to just send all the men who are slaves, give them a weapon, send them into the front lines. So it becomes this issue where I have no doubt that with the amazing heroes and leaders that Ulthuan has, they could definitely do some damage to Vellond. I just don't think they could actually destroy Vellond because Dark Elf and Vellond society, as stated earlier at the beginning of this video, are very different. While Etharion the Grim could cripple Naggarond and nearly get Malekith to surrender, he would not be able to cripple Vellond in the exact same way. In order to cripple Vellond, it would have to be a war of attrition, an upfront engagement, where you actually get in there in the nitty-gritty of war, sieging their cities, taking it over one by one. But even then, if you take over a city, that just unites the Dark Elves in Vellond to fight harder. We saw this with the War for Aran, where the moment Vellond was targeting Aran, they were not giving up. They didn't care how many years it took, how many lives it took spent. The Dark Elves were unified. And if they didn't achieve their war goal, which was taking over Aran, then they would have overthrew the vampires because they would have been pissed. So it would be this situation where Ulthuan could maybe take over a few cities, but then King Valdemar would just rally his Dark Elves and say, those are your cities. Those High Elves just took it from you. Kick their ass. I will not stop the war until we get those cities back. And this would drain Ulthuan completely. This would stop their engagements. It is being drained financially, troop-wise, supply-wise. They would be drained. This is why I don't think Ulthuan would really have to worry about being invaded. More like they would have to worry about how to invade Vellond. Now that we have those guys out of the way, we just have one more elf faction to talk about, the Wood Elves. How would they do against the Wood Elves? Really the issue is what would the Wood Elves be willing to sacrifice in order to fight off Vellond? You see, as stated earlier, Vellond has a nationalistic zeal to them. They are very easy to unify and unite against a single target. And if they do feel a particular way about the Wood Elves and their forest, then they will attack them. Now, the main issue would actually be for King Valdemar to somehow instigate the elves to even give a shit. Because you see, the Wood Elves don't have amazing jewelry. They don't have extravagant cities. They're very modest. They're very humble people. And they live in the dirt. So honestly, to get King Valdemar to instigate the Dark Elves to attack, it would actually require a bit of racism. I'm not joking. It would have to be full-on racism. It would have to be King Valdemar just simply tells them that those elves deem their race superior to the Dark Elves, and somehow spin it in a way where the Dark Elves take much umbrage to the idea of an elf claiming to be superior to them. But at the same time, that'd be very, very difficult because, as stated, the Wood Elves just stay to themselves, and they don't really have anything that's worth anything. They just have their forest. And while the wood may be great for craftsmanship, the issue is that Vellond society uses a lot of steel. They use a lot of metal. They don't really care for woodworks at all. Like, in the slightest. They really don't use wood that much. The only wood they could use really is for their bows, but even then they do have a few metal short bows. So it's one of those scenarios where could Vellond attack the Wood Elves and live? Yeah, they would set the forest afire. Because you have to remember, Dark Elves, when they attack cities, it's been reputed that they actually burn shit to the ground. And they like it. They love to burn shit up. and they use their wicked meteor and fire spells to burn shit to the ground. And I have no doubt King Valdemar would 100% send overseers to burn shit down to the ground. But the issue is that what's there to gain? Like, there's really nothing there to gain other than you can stake the territory as your own, which Vellond may do at a later point. If they own the entire world, yeah, they would probably do it. But really, the Wood Elves do a good job making sure that their area is just unremarkable. It's kind of like why people didn't really invade the Spartans in real world history. And it's because the land of Laconia, which is where Sparta was very desolate. There wasn't really much there. Like, sure, a few raw resources, but it wasn't anything nice. Like, the area is just not really notable. And the people aren't that rich either, so you're not getting any money out of it. So, honestly, I would say the Willows would lose in the engagement just from the sheer numbers that are fighting, and also the fact that their forest would be set ablaze because Vellond loves to burn shit. But that's about it. Like, there's really not much to talk about. There's not anything worth taking Athel-Loren over. Oh my god, we're almost done, guys. We have like 6 more factions to go. Whew. Hang in there tight with me, boys. So, the next up, the Dwarves. Now, the Dwarves are very interesting because they usually just hide up in their mountains. And the Dark Elves have actually had history with Dwarves before. Now, this is actually kind of interesting, is that the Dwarves in Warhammer Fantasy are a little bit more scientifically advanced than the Dwarves in Kingdom Under Fire, but not by much. Not by much. In fact, by Kingdom Under Fire 2, they're pretty much equals. Now, the only thing is, though, is that the Dwarves in Kingdom Under Fire seem to be more lackluster in their numbers, whereas the Dwarves in Warhammer seem to actually be more in population size, which is kind of funny, considering that they're both supposed to be, like, pretty much identical. Oh, yeah, we're having low numbers, and then the other side, yeah, we have low numbers too, our holds are getting empty. But then, you know, we see more dwarves in Warhammer than we do in Kingdom Under Fire, so hey, whatever. But either way, Vellond has actually had experience fighting gunpowder weaponry. They've had experience fighting blimps and flying like gyrocopter type things. They've got experience fighting this. And this puts the dwarves at a severe disadvantage. Because most of the time when they fight enemies, they're fighting enemies who are not accustomed to this. Fighting enemies who are not used to being completely ass blasted by a cannon, like the Orcs. Now, I know Skaven's a bit of a different story, but besides that, mostly dwarves usually fight the Orcs. And usually Orcs are just not really used to it, of flying machineries and being blasted to high hell by gunpowder. Now, Vellond, on the other hand, they do have a bit of a weakness to it, because look at their armor. They're basically butt-ass naked. But they do design some armors that do help them resist a little bit to explosives, which is a clear indicator that they understand that they're flawed. They understand that they're weak to explosions. But there's not a whole lot that they can do without sacrificing their core military tactics, which is that they like to fight out in the open. They have a lot of cavalry archers, they have a lot of cavalry in general, and they have really fast infantry who can flank enemy forces. This is what makes Vellond's army so powerful. And this is much like a Spartan 300 moment where the dwarves can hold a choke point. They can hold a mountain for years. Good on them. That's great. But the moment they step out into the open, they are fucked. They're going to be surrounded by horses. They're going to be surrounded by Dark Elves. And they will have to fight with 8 swords stabbing them throughout their body. And this leads to the next thing. The swords that the Dark Elves use are rapiers and scimitars. Basically pointy weapons. Weapons that are designed to pierce armor. And then the elves in Kingdom Under Fire actually use a spell called Elemental Boost. And what that means is they augment their weapons with magic. Now, this magic could be whatever magic the officer is accustomed to. So you may have an officer who uses curse magic. And curse magic, by the way, negates all armor. So if someone touches you with a curse magic, then all that armor you're wearing just got reduced to 0 Zero. So now you have this amazing thick steel armor as a dwarf, and then someone cuts you with that. Now that armor may as well just be leather, because it's not going to protect you against shit. And then you also have a few other magics. The most notable is lightning. Elves use lightning a lot. Now, the reason why they use lightning in Kingdom Under Fire is because they fight a lot of knights. Human knights. People who are just clad head to toe in plate steel armor. Well, metal is a good conductor of electricity. And if you're covered head to toe in gromril or any sort of other item, then they don't really need to use magic on you per se. They just need to put a little bit of science into your armor. Now, while gromril has anti-magic properties, it doesn't have anti-scientific properties. But essentially that would be the goal, is that the Dark Elves would stab a dwarf with enough arrows, with enough blades, that all the electricity would still have an effect even if they're wearing like heavy gromril armor. Even then, it would still have a minor effect. If he's not wearing gromril armor, he's going to get shocked to high hell. He will be electrocuted internally and externally. It would be quite a firework display. Then we also come into the other issue. Vellond has no issues sieging somebody for a very, very long time. And this is actually interesting, is that, let's say Vellond is sieging Karak 8 Peaks, right? And Karak 8 Peaks uses its 100 cannons and just starts blowing away forces left and right. Well, there's only so long they can keep that up before they start to run out of ammunition. And the thing is that Vellond does not give up, as I said before. They don't give up. So how would they keep up with this constant warfare when they're not killing anything? Well, we actually see what they do in these situations. What they do is they employ the use of liches. They have many liches in their kingdom, and this is the first time I've had to talk about them. But when they sieged the city of Hiranadin, what they did was they had liches resurrect the dead as ghouls, basically zombies, and just keep charging at the walls over and over again, and there was no limit. Now, we come back to what we originally said. What happens when the dwarves just keep blasting them and blasting them and blasting them with their cannons? Well, that's what's going to happen. They're going to summon their ghouls that are dead. And the thing with the ghouls is that they're so charged with dark magical energies that what happens is a ghoul will sacrifice its body onto a structure, onto an army, whatever, and it explodes. And it explodes so devastatingly it will actually shatter a wall, no matter how finely crafted it is. So now you just have this army of ghouls because you just keep blasting their shit. And now they're going to send those ghouls to just constantly explode onto your walls if any of them break through. Now what happens when you're finally out of ammunition? It could be years. It could be 10 years. Vellond does not give a fuck. They will keep on sieging. So 10 years of constant artillery bombardment. 10 years of constantly one guy getting through. Now there's holes all over your walls. What do you do now? Well, Vellond's ready to charge in. They've waited long enough. And Vellond, the Dark Elves, get a little impatient. Like, they sieged Hiranadin for about 9 months. And they got really, really antsy, and they just could not wait. So while you're holed up there, they're going to be raiding around the perimeter, making sure that you have no farms, making sure you have no trade, any supplies. So yeah, things are going to get very desperate for you very, very fast when Vellond decides to set their eyes on a target. And that's usually how this sort of engagement would work. Now, sure, dwarves have runes, and they have really cool magic with those runes, but the issue isn't the individual. Because you may see a repeating pattern here. Ulthuan, the Dark Elves, the Lizardmen, they all have phenomenal heroes, phenomenal individuals. But these are not what's going to win the war. They may be able to turn the tide, but they will never secure victory. And the reason why is because Vellond is a nation, not some sort of storyline, plot-driven, humbug of a society. No, it's a real concrete society that doesn't crumble easily. It's very ruthless. It's almost Roman in its type of structure. It's got a very monolithic culture. it's very tough. It's tough in its ideals. It's tough in its people. It is a very tough thing to fight. And it's why it's so interesting to me. It's why I like it so much. It's like literally the Roman Empire. So while we're talking about dwarves, let's talk about orcs. How would orcs be handled? Or in other words, the greenskins, the orcs and goblins. Well, the issue is that the orcs and goblins in this universe are very different from the orcs in Kingdom Under Fire. The orcs in Kingdom Under Fire are more humble, they're more willing to accept mediocrity, like farming and such. These orcs are very determined to wage war and constantly attack people. And this is where I believe the annexation of Hexter would come into play again. But this time, it would be a lot more different. Instead of doing what they did with the Norskins, it'd be a little bit more different, because the orcs here are much dumber. Much, much dumber. So what it would be simply many orc and ogre, I mean not orc and ogre, I'm thinking of Kingdom Under Fire, but orc and goblin nations would be given free stuff. In exchange, they help their armies out. They lend their aid to them. Now, this may be a bit of a downside because Dark Elves will bitch and moan about, oh, I saw a few of the goblins stealing through my shit and they took some of my jewels. I fucking hate these guys. I'm not joking. The Dark Elves actually do complain a lot about sharing quarters with other species. But I think that that's pretty much where the orcs and goblins would be. They wouldn't try to annex them once they realize what the orcs and goblins are. When they realize that they're just a never-ending tide of just shit, and that there's really no way to subjugate them, then the only thing that's left is to appease them, make them somewhat happy. And this is where it would become a very interesting scenario where the Dark Elves and the vampires would find ways of manipulating their societies and making it where the orcs and the goblins are never strong enough to wage a war against them, but at the same time have enough weapons and ammunition to fight each other and then fight their enemies for them. They would basically be like a free military service. It's very different from Norsca, though, because Norsca, the goal would be to eventually annex the tribes and actually take them over and bring them into the fold of Vellond after many, many, dealings. But with the orcs and goblins, that would never be an option. Orcs and goblins are too fickle. They're just too dangerous. They're constantly changing their minds. It's just better just to keep them misguided. Keep directing them towards other endeavors. Keep directing them at each other. Directing them at the ogres. Directing them at the empire. Direct them somewhere else that's not you. And that would probably work out most of the time. Other times, orcs and goblins may see through your ruse and they may decide to say, nah, I'm not going to crump that guy. I'm going to crump you instead. In which case, the overseer would just have to sit back and tell King Valdemar, hey, this one shithead war boss, he doesn't like our dealings and he says that he could take from us what we gave to him freely. In which case, King Valdemar would say, okay, what about the other tribe? The other tribe next to him? I heard they want to tumble with the war boss and test his mettle. Let's give them some good shit. Let's give them better shit than what we gave him. Yeah. The Vellond nation fights dirty, dude. They don't fight clean. They fight dirty. So, we already kind of mentioned it, but the ogres. How would Vellond really react to the ogres? I honestly think it'd be much the same situation, but the only difference is that the ogres usually aren't much of a threat to begin with. And if the Dark Elves are placed in the Nagarond area, they wouldn't really have much contact anyways. So I would just say they would just be mercenaries, what they basically already are. And if they ever do decide to raid Vellond, Vellond would do to them what Cathay did to them. Summon many, many meteors, use wicked magics like ghoul armies and shit, and just overrun any ogre army that comes their way. To teach them a lesson like, back the fuck off. We are much, much stronger than what you can chew. The Great Maw himself could not bite into our nation. It would be basically the goal that Vellond would secure. Now, while an ogre is very tough and very durable, and they do have their little goblinies, the little, nose pickers, they are not quite a military. And this is the reason why the ogres are never usually big threats. They may be able to wipe out an army, but they could never wipe out a city. They could never go around destroying entire nations, is because they just don't have a professional army. They don't have this unification that's needed to form such an army. Much like the Orcs and Norskins, they would just be pretty much ignored and just appeased through some way. Just pretty much distracted, keep them the fuck away from our borders as much as you possibly can. Alright, it's been a while, but now we're going to talk about the Bretonnians. Now, the Bretonnians I actually think would have a lot of issues fighting Vellond, because Vellond is actually used to fighting humanity, and they're very used to fighting this type of humanity, a medieval society humanity. I think Bretonnia would get absolutely crushed. 100%. They would get crushed and dominated. The only thing that's fighting in their advantage is that they have flying Pegasus knights, and they do have some crazy knight magics, but besides all the enchanted armor they have and all the crazy kings they have and all the crazy power those knights have, Vellond is specifically designed to kill knights. Their rapiers pierce their knight's armor, their lightning magic to augment their blades, so not only do they stab you, but they electrocute the shit out of you. And then they also have really, really fast light cavalry that's faster than any other cavalry out there. Then they have cavalry archers. So you can chase them down with your horses, great. But the issue is that their horses are faster and they're going to hit you with arrows. And those arrows, as I said, are augmented with lightning or some sort of magical prowess to the point they're just killing you if you keep chasing them. This is one of the issues I have with Bretonnia, is that their military is really badass. I actually like Bretonnia a lot as a tabletop setting. I actually like playing them. But the thing is, though, is that they're very stiff. They're very, I would just say, inflexible. They're unable to do creative things. And this is because of their society, but also because they only have peasants and then they have knights. That is it. There is no in-between men. There is no heavy foot soldiers. There is no crossbowmen. There is no anything. It's just that. Knights and then peasants. The peasants may actually give the Vellond army a big run for its money, funny enough. We see this with Kingdom Under Fire, was that Hronodin is kind of like a giant peasant army. And the reason why is because Hronodin is just countrymen. They're just farmers. They're just your average day man fighting against Vellond. And they're actually tenacious. They're very vicious, guarding their homes. So if Bretonnia just unleashes massive waves of peasants, sure, the peasants may die, but the peasants would probably be more successful in fighting the Dark Elves than the knights would be. Because the knights, if they get entangled in melee, if they get absolutely shot down to smithereens by the archers, they're fucking useless. They didn't score any victory points. They may be able to get a few good charges in on the Dark Elf infantry, which is great. But Dark Elf infantry tend to flank and swarm. And once you're surrounded, I'm sorry, knights, you're boned. You're literally boned. Like, there's nothing you can do. Now, the nice thing about Bretonnian's land is that it's this giant open farm fields. And I have no doubt that this would be how Vellond would somehow cross the Great Ocean, is that they would somehow cross the Great Ocean and take over parts of Bretonnian land and then swiftly establish a second Vellond. And this is how they would just establish it, was by doing some sort of senatorial thing where they have maybe 2 kings and 1 senate. That could be possible. That would be very interesting. Establish King Valdemar's son, Lionheart, as the king of these faraway lands. But that faraway lands is still connected. Kind of like an Eastern Rome versus Western Rome type scenario. And I have no doubt they would be very, very successful in Bretonnia. The farmlands would reap very, very profitable loot from the wine that they make. And then they also do have a few mines that can give them nice steel weaponry. And the peasants, well, they were already used to being enslaved by the knights. Now they're just being enslaved by a bunch of Dark Elves, which isn't really any different. So, hey, I mean, work is work. A lord is a lord. So what? You know, nothing really different. And that's where I think Bretonnia would just crumble, is because Vellond is already used to them. So now let's talk about the next human faction, the Empire. If Bretonnia fell and no one was really there to stop Vellond because the High Elves couldn't fight it, the Dwarves, they would just be besieged and they wouldn't be able to get out. All that's left is the Empire. So how would the Empire fare? Well, I think the first thing is that Vellond would not actually openly engage the Empire for a lot of reasons. The Empire has many, many forts, all long choke points that stops anywhere from Bretonnia and anywhere else from engaging. But they do have a few other ways of being attacked. And the main way would be infiltration. We talked about infiltration before, but I think this would be more prevalent now, where you would see liches being snuck into the Empire's borders, resurrecting massive amounts of ghouls, raiding villages, infecting them with pestilence and converting them into zombies. But the issue with this is that while they may be doing that, the Empire has experience dealing with this sort of subterfuge, and they would try to prevent against it. But they would have other issues. Like Vellond has no issues going into a criminal syndicate that's in the Empire and supplying them weaponry. They have no qualms about doing that. They've done it before in Kingdom Under Fire 2. I have no doubt they probably will do it again here. And I do think that that's pretty much what would happen, is that many dark rituals would be engaged underground that would cause mass panic, mass death, mass plagues. And this is where Vellond would just try their very, very best to cripple the Empire internally before they engage it externally. And the reason why is because the Empire is very, very dangerous. I'm not an Empire fanboy in the slightest. I actually don't really care for them when it comes to Warhammer Fantasy. Not at all. But I do give them the respect that they deserve. They are very powerful. They have ancient artifacts in their vaults, in their very capital, Reichland, where they can solve just about any issue. They have one thing that just totally destroys all undead the moment that they hit it. They have another artifact that just totally obliterates magic, 100%. So it's like, okay, the Empire has just about every tool for every job. They have guns, they have crossbows, they have flying men, they have ground men, they have everything, and they have plenty at its disposal, whatever that is. So it's this very dangerous society that can't be pushed or shoved easily. Now, could Vellond do it? Maybe. I think they probably could. But the issue becomes is that how long would it take to take out Vellond or the Empire? It could take years. It could probably be like a 100-year war situation where Vellond just keeps tirelessly engaging fortress after fortress and just keeps tirelessly attacking their cities, but the Empire just keeps miraculously surviving either through their god, through their technology, or through their gold. It could be anything. The Empire has a lot of tools at its disposal to help deal with these situations. And even if the Dark Elves bring about orc mercenaries like Arachnarok spiders, or Norscan mercenaries with their feral mammoths, or their nasty skin wolves, the Dark Elves would still have a bit of a hard time because the Empire is used to this. The Empire is built upon the idea of a last stand scenario, where humanity just makes valiant efforts to hold these fortresses at all cost. And it could be something that would be very difficult for Vellond to deal with. They could eventually, over time, get through, and they could do a lot of raiding. I could definitely see that. Like breaking through the Drakenwald and just raiding the shit out of that area, going into Middenheim and ransacking a few temples of Ulrich, or raiding a few temples of Tal. Like, they could do that, no problem. And it would definitely cause a lot of upheaval in the Empire society about why the fuck is the Emperor not doing anything about it. But could they openly engage it? Probably not. It's really up in the air. It's much like with the High Elf situation. They probably could, but because of how much arsenals and how much gold and wealth the Empire has at its disposal, it would not be an easy war. It could be done, and it might be done, but it would be very, very costly. And as I stated before, if Vellond established like a second Vellond in Bretonnia, they would be dealing with a lot of internal issues like Dark Elves demanding that the second Vellond becomes a Dark Elf kingdom in its own right, like a new Cadus. And there would be a bit of internal issues that they would be dealing with already because they've expanded so fucking much. And this is where the Empire would really just be banking on that. They would bank a lot on this idea that, hey, Vellond is dealing with a lot of internal strife. All we gotta do is survive. And they may just be overthrown by their own Dark Elves. So it's probably where the Empire and Vellond would stay at. Is this kind of stalemate, much like with the High Elves. And that's because they have a very professional army. They have a lot of gold at their disposal. They have faith on their side. Like, there are many times where Sigmar just really helps saves the day. And Vellond doesn't really have many of those things. They just have a really tough society. They have a good economy, but they couldn't withstand this kind of constant backlash where they're finally about to take over the fort, and all of a sudden Sigmar's hammer just comes down and just destroys everything. Yeah, they wouldn't be able to do this every 100 years. Lastly is the Skaven. Now, you see, the Skaven I actually think are a little too overpowered in the books. Like, I've always made jokes about it, but in Warhammer End Times, I'm not joking, Skaven did, like, everything. And it always pissed me off to no end when people are like, Chaos won the End Times. No, the fuck they didn't. Skaven won the End Times. Reason being, name me a civilization that got destroyed by chaos, and only chaos. Only the Empire, but even then, what did chaos really do to destroy the Empire? They had to call upon their Skaven allies to come breaking through. Besides that, Skaven decimated the vampires. They decimated the Tomb Kings. They destroyed the Orcs. They destroyed the Dwarves. They destroyed, like, all the Lizardmen. So what exactly did Chaos do in the End Times? Like, what did they honestly do? Did they destroy the High Elves? No. Did they destroy the Dark Elves? No. What did they do? Nothing. So it's one of those things where it's like, I think Skaven is just too overpowered, and I'll always complain about it. And at the flip side, I just think that Skaven would just be ridiculous. Like, they're just a ridiculous faction to begin with, but with all their crazy technology, their crazy plagues, and their rusty blades versus the Dark Elves, who don't wear much armor to begin with, they would be Swiss cheese. Army-wise, they would be annihilated. Now, faction-wise, they would also be annihilated. The reason why is because Skaven society is very difficult to attack. They're very deep underground, so already Vellond cannot attack them. But what about vice versa? How well do they do defending against Skaven? Because that's pretty much all you can hope for. Well, they wouldn't do too good either, because Skaven attack whenever they see opportunity. And if Vellond is weak, well, it's going to be very difficult to fight off Skaven, rebellious Dark Elves, and on top of that, hope to God that none of your guys get assassinated. Like if Clan Eshin decided to assassinate a bunch of overseers, Dark Elves would take it upon themselves to say, hey, fuck the power, fuck the man, we're going to overthrow this kingdom. Yeah, let's get this revolution started, baby. And then on the other side, if Clan Pestilence just uses their rusty blades and engages in very attritional warfare where they just keep poisoning the Dark Elves, poisoning, it's not going to be a good war because Skaven outnumber everybody, like everyone, in the millions. So here's the Dark Elves who are now, for once in all the Warhammer scenarios, they're finally outnumbered by somebody. And they're outnumbered by somebody who thrives on attritional warfare. Not a good scenario to begin with. Then we can also look at magic. And while, yes, Vellond magic would be amazing, just dumping meteors and blizzards and just giant poisonous vines emerging from the ground, the issue is that Skaven magic is very unpredictable. So you could have situations where, yeah, Skaven armies get completely obliterated by magic, but they don't rely on magic. Magic helps them, but it's not their crutch. They don't rely upon it. So, with that being said, I would say Skaven would win, obviously. Now, there is a few factions I'm not going to discuss, like Cathay, Nippon. That's because we don't know too much about those. And then finally, the one faction that everyone's probably going to bitch about is the vampires. Freeze 700 didn't say about the vampires. Well, honestly, they're not even much of a nation to begin with. So by attacking the Empire, you're essentially attacking the vampires, because the vampires actually live in human society. And then we have the Tomb Kings, which honestly, as stated before, there's really nothing there. There's really nothing. Like, if there's really nothing to gain except riches, King Voldemort would just let his Dark Elves raid it. He really wouldn't give a fuck. He wouldn't try to attack them. Especially when he's fighting over ruins. Much like the Lizardmen. You're literally defending, like, desolate areas. What's there for me to gain? If anything, after I take over everything, I'm going to have to rebuild it all because there's nothing even here to begin with. Like, it's more work than what it's worth. And that's pretty much how Vellond would work if they ever did enter the Warhammer universe. That's more likely how it would work as far as series of events. Where, again, after Vellond establishes a second colony in Bretonnia, they may decide to take over Athel Loren. They may decide to do that. And they could 100% do it. But it wouldn't be like a war for gold or anything like that. It would actually cost them money to attack it. But it would just be to claim more territory, to establish newer cities inside this region, and take the wood that isn't burned to a crisp and use it for the infrastructure. That is it. So besides that, it's been Free 700. I hope you guys enjoyed. This has been a very long video. This has been an hour. Holy shit. This has been a long one. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you guys actually watched through everything, just answer me this one question. What Kingdom Under Fire faction is your personal favorite? And then tell me in one little small paragraph why that is. That's how I know you actually watched this video in its entirety. Besides that, see you guys next time.